Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Greatly appreciated. So behind me I have all of my jumbo brown Couturnus quail, as you can see, in my new cage that I actually built. I also made this little stand here as well using scrap wood. I understand in the last couple videos that I've made with cages on how you can build them and whatnot, I may not have gone over all the details and just kind of flown right through it, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail to show you exactly how I made this, so that way you can make one yourself. As you can see here along the cage, there are lots of little clips here, including some spring hooks. And I ran out of some wire on this, so it looks kind of janky, so I tried to make it look nice using two different pieces. This cage is actually 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, 16 inches tall. This I made it about a 1/4 inch larger on each side just to make sure that the cage was accommodated, so that way I could be able to put these in, prevent the cage from moving around. This is just a 2x4 actually cut in half. You can actually buy these pre-cut, or you can make them your own if you have a table saw, but I'm just going to go over some of the details of what you can do if you don't have any of that equipment. Alright, so just going to do a small example, nothing too big, too fancy. Just got a little bit of wire, just kind of give you a little bit of information about what we're doing. So when it comes to making the cages, from what I've experienced, if you have a wooden frame, you can use this 20 gauge wire, which is actually 1 inch by 1 inch. And that works just fine, going all the way around the edges. You can use it for the base as long as you got like some wooden supports underneath it. That'll work out just fine. Just make sure that you have enough supports underneath it that, you know, it doesn't start to sag under the weight of whatever that you have inside. If you just want like a standalone cage or anything like that, that is not supported by the wood, like as a box or a frame, then you're going to want to use this 16 gauge. This is a different kind of wire, which is actually 1 inch by 1.5 inch, which actually is a lot sturdier and really, really tough to work with. But it is very strong and does not sag like its counterpart. These can be normally found at Home Depot. They're fairly cheap, depending on the size that you're making. But if you're only having like a few quail, like maybe like 6 or 7 or something like that, I'd probably go with this bigger stuff. That way you can be able to tote them around a little bit better. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and dive right into this now. So you can use either these dikes, if you have them. If not, you can buy them. They're like $10 or something like that at Walmart. Or if you're more experienced, you can use a grinder. The grinder is very, very nice. It actually cuts through this stuff really, really quickly. And you can get into these little grooves right here. And I'll show you in a second why it's really nice, because it can clean it up really, really nice. If you go ahead and use these dikes, as you cut them, you'll notice there's a little bit of an edge there. Whereas if you take the grinder, you can actually get more into that grooved area and clean it off. Otherwise, your shirts will grab on it, you'll scratch your arms. Fun. I prefer to use the grinder, but if I didn't have my grinder, I was actually using this the whole time. But these work just as good. If you have like one of those small little Dremel tools, you can use that to kind of use a little grinder wheel to cut that off. Those are inexpensive as well if you're not too confident in using one of these. These are a little bit more intense, but they work beautifully. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and get to the making of it. This is why I say use the grinder if you have it. This does take a lot of time to cut. Because what you're doing is now you're separating it. At the same time as separating it, you're now left over with this overhang. And you're still having to go through and cut it. If you cut it more, instead of directly up and down, more at an angle, you can kind of get a cleaner cut. It may not look like much, but it saves a lot of time when you're trying to go through, because it doesn't grab as much and it doesn't hurt as bad. But let's just say that you've gone ahead and gotten your whole cage taken care of. Everything's been cleaned off. I'm going to show you here on this 16 gauge. Just because working with the 20 gauge is a little more difficult when we're trying to connect it with another piece. So I found these off of Amazon. There's many different kinds of models that you can use. I don't remember the specific brand. I think it used to be on there. It's worn off. But it uses these little J hooks. Now these little clips are known by other things, but I've just read that they're J hooks off of the website that I've come across. Now to be able to use these properly, what you want is to take that hook, that J, and you want it right in there. The reason for that being is because if these edges are not supported on the side, it doesn't curl as nicely, especially when you've got it inside of your project and trying to get it in. It just doesn't hold true. It starts to warp. But anyways, what you'll do is that you take your two pieces. You can do this many different ways depending on how you're set up. You can just go ahead and take it, wedge it in between. Now you want to make sure your hook is on the other side before you finish your crimp. Otherwise, it will not engage. But once you get a couple of those together, you can actually start seeing the edges of your cage coming together. Go ahead and get another one on. Now, if you are at a point where everything's already together, you can still do it this way. There really is no wrong way of doing it. Mine's just having troubles getting in between some of these wires sometimes, but so you can still do it that way. Just depends on how you want to hook it up and put it together. But that's really the basis of hooking up the cage together and getting everything all spliced. Now you can do the exact same with this. Again, this is a lot easier to cut. It does not take as much work as that 16 gauge, but you'll want to just go ahead and figure out exactly what dimensions that you want. Again, that cage out there is got about a 3 foot by 2 foot area for each of those little quail. You can make it any size that you want. But if you're going to have it so that way you just want to tote that around, put it anywhere that you want with no supports, I would go with the 16 gauge. But if you're just already making everything out of wood, then I would definitely go with this. This is a lot cheaper. You can go a lot further with this, and it doesn't require as much of that to be able to make the cage because you've got the wood to be able to help make up the difference of that. And you use less J hooks, and there's definitely less wire cutting and less trimming of those edges. So for the framing of the bottom of that cage, that little table that you're seeing, this is kind of just the rough blueprint that I made of it. I went ahead and drew out exactly how I wanted it, you know, the style and whatnot, supports and all, where all the wood pieces were going to go. Then I went ahead and actually started measuring out exactly how far one piece would be, as well as the other one, and every individual piece. And then I started accounting for all the other pieces. So in this one, the actual cage itself was about 24 inches and a quarter by 73 inches and a quarter. So that's the whole thing. But I wanted to go ahead and make it just quarter inch bigger on each side, just to make sure that I did have enough overhang that the cage sat on it instead of hanging over the edges. So I went ahead and stretched it out just by that 1/2 inch, as you can see. And then I went ahead and found what I needed for this, which is obviously a 1/4 inch bigger here. Obviously I didn't really need much for that. But then I went ahead and figured out that each of the board is about 1 5/8 if you cut a 2 by 4 1/2. Kind of figure out what the dimensions were those and which way that I had it. Because one way it's going to be 1 5/8, the other side is going to be 1 1/2. So depending on how you want to turn your board, you're going to want to go ahead and make up for those measurements. But I went ahead and planned it out, every single piece that I was going to need. Kind of gave myself a little drawing just so I could be able to figure it out. Normally at Home Depot or any other wood store that you get your wood at, they're going to be 8 feet long. So I just went ahead and kind of planned accordingly exactly how much that I was going to have left over. I actually ended up using 6 boards instead of 7. I was able to get actually some of these over using the 71 inches because it ended up being supposed to be 96 inches for a single board. saved myself a board. But actually all the scraps that I had were all scraps, so it worked out great for me. When I first started working on my woodworking, I really had no idea what I was doing. I had some of the basic skills of being able to use a screwdriver, not so much of the drill or anything, just because my dad didn't have any small ones. He had the huge ones that are like 10, 15 pounds, so it seemed to a 12-year-old. But when I actually started working on it, I went basic. I really didn't want to spend a lot of money, so I went with this Black & Decker one. It's been pretty good. Didn't have any problems with it until I started working on a dog kennel for a client, and ended up being, that did not have as much power as I needed it to. So I went ahead, splurged a little bit, and got a Milwaukee. It was a night and day difference. Not saying that you have to be able to get it done. Again, that Black & Decker, I think it was a 20 volt. Yeah, it worked just fine for what I was doing at the time. But when I was trying to use the pocket jig to cut everything out, it just did not have the power to bore into that cedar that I was drilling into to be able to put those pocket screws in there. It was a pain. So I went ahead and upgraded, but again, it was a night and day difference. But you do not need that to be able to start building anything that you have. A simple drill like that will get you a long ways. So I wanted to go ahead and make the project as clean cut as I possibly could, so that way you wouldn't see the screws, and I'll show you here in a second. But I use this little Craig jig. It makes basically what are called pocket holes. So essentially it bores into the wood just enough so that way it goes in at an angle and it connects the two bores together. This allows you to be able to hide the screws so you don't have to screw them into the side. On my project, I was just using one screw just because the wood was so thin. I had to use another screw on the other side, but that's besides the point. If you do not want to buy this little setup, it does come with this drill piece. Sorry, can't remember what the name is for that. But you can go ahead and instead, if you don't want to, you can use a 3/8 inch bit. And if you're able to figure out what the angle is for yours, if you really want to, you can use that. You don't even have to use this. You can just do any method that you want. I just find that this makes a nice cleaner cut when you're making everything and putting it all together, but it is completely optional for that. Now, as you can see, there is no hole up here on this side. I did that for a reason, just because I know that there's a lot of poop that likes to get wedged up here, and I didn't want that to get wedged inside of the hole, but I'll show you what that pocket hole looks like. Go ahead and put those back up there. And that's what the hole looks like. Now, they recommend that you use their screws, but their screws are super expensive, so I use the Spax Starbit screws. They work so much easier than the other things, and they're a lot cheaper too. But I did have to go ahead and put something on this side just to prevent them from twisting around, just because there wasn't enough space to put two on that side. But yeah. Go ahead and show you how you can be able to cut those yourself if you don't have any kind of power tools. Simple investment that I made was for these Bessie clamps. There are better clamps than this, but it certainly beat using the C clamp that I was using for the longest time. With these, you can at least adjust it to any height that you want. Just press down on there, and when you're ready, it just seats down and you tighten it. Best investment that I've also made here in this project. I mentioned those little Spax screws. I recommend getting the number 8 just for your small, simple things. The bigger this number is, the bigger the head on that screw is going to be, and the more space that it's going to have to take up, and you're going to have to get a bigger bit for that. Start off with the basic kit. Didn't have anything fancy. Just had this DeWalt. I'm missing a few over the years, but that's typical. Went ahead and used those to go ahead and make the pilot hole for the screws, just so that way the screws could fit in there. Just enough that it wasn't wider than the screw, but not too wide that I couldn't get it to grip inside of the wood. Because if you go ahead and have it be in the same size of this, these little teeth don't have a chance to grab onto anything, so it makes it kind of hard for them. Sorry if it's out of focus. But then if you want to go ahead and make sure that the head of the screw fits in, you can go ahead and get one of these to countersink the hole, so that way it's just wide enough that this will start going in just a little bit, so it has a little hidey hole. I didn't have this giant miter saw that I've got right now. but I had this simple handsaw. No regrets. Love this thing, still use it to this day. Granted, not as much since I have that. Another wonderful tool that I've come across that I absolutely adore are these pouring spouts. This one's called the Glue Bot. Just go ahead and pour your glue inside of this, and then you can go ahead and just tip it over without having to get the original bottles that they have in like Home Depot, where you have to completely turn it upside down, wait forever. This one already fills up the reservoir. You just tip it over and squeeze, and it pours out. That has been a time saver. No regrets with that at all. But I'm going to go ahead and show you how to use that handsaw so that way you can be able to cut your own projects. So here we are with that clamp again. Push down to release. Find a good place where underneath it's going to grip good, because if there's a divot on the inside of it, it's just going to be holding onto this metal part, possibly damaging what you're attaching it to. So you want to go ahead and make sure that this rubber foot is attached to the underside and that it has good surface on it. Cinch it down and twist. Now, you probably want a second point of contact just to make sure it doesn't move, or if you have a vise, that's going to actually work out better. Now, one of the key points when you're cutting with this is to make sure that your blade is straight from down, because if you turn it like this, you're going to start going at an angle when you cut. Now, instead of just pulling back the whole time, you want to push forward. Pull back easy. Push forward. Pull easy. Just keep your hands straight and keep going. If you can go the full length of the tang, it's going to be better for you, because then you're going to be able to use all those teeth, and it's going to be less work for you when you're cutting it. I was going a little bit fast, but if you're able to go slow, it will reward you in time. That's not too bad. Pretty darn straight. So, for that pocket screw demonstration, this is what I was having to work with. I was working with only this side, because I wanted to go ahead and have the longer part down, just kind of make the narrow part what I was working on. You can take this. It gives you a recommendation of their product that you can use for this. You don't have to. If you have the hand strength, you can hold down this thing. I do sometimes, but then sometimes this thing just likes to get away from me. So really the only option that I have is to go ahead and clamp it down. There are fancier jigs that you can get with this. Ones that you can actually have on your table. You just put your thing in, drill it in. They have ones that are just a single piece, but I prefer the double just on the project that I was working on. So as you can see, makes a nice little burrow inside of there, because it goes in at an angle, and what it's trying to do is grab as much wood of this wood as possible and grab into the other piece. On the flip side, it gives you the dimensions. You probably won't see that very clearly on this, but it gives you the dimensions of 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1, 1/4, and 1.5 inch. Basically, that's going to determine on the width or the depth of the wood that you're cutting into. And because these weren't really any longer than 1.5 inches, I just kept it to 1 1/4 because I didn't want it to go too far, and that's what I was working with. But I could have gone to 1.5, but I was working with 2-inch screws, so I really couldn't go any further than 1.25 inches on that. But they have different lengths. They have up to 3 inches, so that way you can go into 2x4s and etc. I love this little thing. Probably would upgrade to the base that you can actually set on your table, but that gets to be a little bit more in a different price bracket for anyone that's starting up. So I think this is about like $40 or so. This is probably about $10. Box of screws is probably about $12. These clamps, for I think about 4 of them, may have been around $15. This was about $10 or so. Again, with those J clamps, J hooks, I think the crimper was probably about $15, and the hooks themselves was probably maybe closer to like $5, or depending on the amount that you get. But you do go through a lot of them. I didn't like the container that they came in, so I use this old little fish container. Hold on to them just fine. And then I can go ahead and take this and throw it on the inside. Holds on to it just fine. So yeah, if you have any questions, or if you want me to go ahead and show you a little bit more about how I've been doing this, go ahead and drop that in the comments below. Let me know.